Our next cycle is the carbon cycle. The reservoirs for the carbon cycle are in the ocean and the atmosphere. We start here at CO2 in the atmosphere. That is taken up by plants in the process of photosynthesis, and it is made into carbohydrates and other organic molecules in living organisms. The living organisms eat those molecules, break those molecules back down into carbon dioxide and water through the process of respiration. So that's the basics part of the carbon cycle. There's also other things that feed into this. The ocean stores quite a lot of carbon dioxide. It can absorb it. Exactly how much is kind of a question now as we're facing global climate change because of extra carbon dioxide in the air. Some of that carbon dioxide will be changed into calcium carbonate or lime, and that settles down into the sediments of the ocean. The sediments can then weather to go back into the photosynthesis cycle. And of course, the carbon dioxide in the ocean can be taken up by algae and go into photosynthesis. The major human impact on the carbon cycle is two things: deforestation and fossil fuels. Deforestation is cutting down and burning great areas so that a lot of that carbon dioxide that's been tied up in the biomass is now being burned and being dumped back into carbon dioxide. The larger problem, since that deforestation was all above ground, a larger problem is that we've been taking carbon out of the ground and burning it. So it's the fossil fuels that have really contributed to the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Not that deforestation is trivial, because we would have to let those trees grow back in some way to take the carbon out, but it's the dumping of those fossil fuels that's really making the difference here. You can read in your notes about the effects of this this extra carbon dioxide on climate destabilization and all of the things that we're anticipating are going to happen as the atmosphere warms. One way to deal with that carbon dioxide problem is to look at alternate sources of energy. Here is a picture from the book of solar panels out west where it's very sunny, and the bottom picture is a picture that I took south of Rockford at a wind farm. So that's right here in Illinois. There's also interest in biofuels right now, such as soy diesel from soybean oil, ethanol. I want to talk a little bit about ethanol from corn. One of the problems with corn ethanol is that corn is part of our food chain. We don't eat very much of it as corn. We eat much more of it as livestock feed, chicken feed, pig feed, cattle feed. So that's one thing, it's taking it away from our food supply. Another thing is that corn is the most petroleum-intensive crop we grow. There's petroleum that drives the tractors. There's petroleum that goes into making the fertilizers and the pesticides and the herbicides that get sprayed on corn. We've kind of gotten in this habit of growing corn that has a growing season that's too long for our season, so then the corn has to be dried using even more petroleum. So the yield to input ratio for corn ethanol is 1.3 to 1. We get 1.3 gallons of ethanol for every gallon of petroleum we put into that. It's just not efficient. The estimated yield per acre is only 354 gallons. Another problem with corn is that the carbohydrate is in the form of starch, and that starch has to be broken down some way because the yeast that makes the ethanol does not like starch. Sugarcane has an advantage because yeast does like sugar, so there doesn't have to be any processing with that. You put the yeast with the sugar and out comes the ethanol. So that puts its yield to input ratio much higher at 8 to 1 with an estimated ethanol yield per acre of 662. Cellulosic refers to making ethanol from cellulose, which is the leftover parts. Corn stover is everything about the corn except the kernels, which would be the cob, the leaves, the stalk. That has a yield to input of 10 to 1. Switchgrass is something that could be harvested again and again. It's a perennial grass. So if we could figure out how to scale that production up, we could get a huge amount of ethanol per acre, and there would be less environmental impacts for that. This would all be above ground carbon. So that would be a carbon zero source. All of these would be carbon zero, except perhaps for the corn, which has a lot of petroleum input to it. Our next cycle is the nitrogen cycle. It has its reservoir in the atmosphere, and it is a component of proteins. That's why we need nitrogen. We need carbon for energy. We need nitrogen for proteins. We're going to start with nitrogen gas in the atmosphere. Nitrogen gas is a very strongly bonded molecule, there's only a few things on Earth that can do anything with it, and those would be the nitrogen-fixing bacteria and the cyanobacteria. They can take that triple bonded nitrogen gas out of the atmosphere and change it into nitrates and ammonia, which you can think of as plant fertilizers. Those nitrates and ammonia are then taken up by plant proteins, which are then passed along to consumer proteins. We have a short circuit in the cycle with the decomposers. The decomposers are then changing those consumer proteins back into the nitrate and ammonia, which can be taken back by the plants again. We also complete the larger cycle to the non-living system with denitrifying bacteria. Back in Chapter 1, we talked about how there are bacteria that can do things that no other thing on Earth can do, and one of the reasons we should be thankful every day for bacteria is that they're the only things that can fix nitrogen, and also the only things that turn it back into nitrogen gas. The disruptions by human activity include deforestation. All of the cycles are impacted by deforestation, and the conversion of grasslands to farm fields, which drastically reduces soil nitrogen and decreases soil fertility. The application of nitrogen fertilizers disrupts soil chemistry and causes loss of other soil nutrients that are important for plant growth, for example, calcium and magnesium. When you think about soil, you need to think about soil particles that have a finite number of binding sites for these soil nutrients. We've converted the forests and grasslands to farm field. The nitrogen is going down. We're now going to replace that nitrogen with fertilizer, but we dump so much nitrogen on it that it bumps out other nutrients, so we're losing calcium and magnesium, and we're going to develop different problems with our crops. Like the water cycle, one of the effects of deforestation is runoff. Runoff from the fields contaminates the waterways with fertilizer and disrupts the water ecosystems, as we mentioned before. We have fossil fuels again contributing to the nitrogen cycle. These add nitrates to the air. That contributes to acid rain. Once the nitrogen dioxide gets into the air, it combines with water to form nitric acid. Furthermore, nitrates get carried north, where trees are usually nitrogen limited. It makes those trees think they're in a happier place than they normally would be, and they tend to not go dormant in a timely manner and suffer from winter kill. That also disrupts the competitive balance up there, and species diversity declines. When extra nitrogen is added to areas that are normally nitrogen limited, then other tree species can move in and disrupt that balance. Our last cycle is the phosphorus cycle. The major reservoir for the phosphorus cycle is rock. We need phosphorus for our nucleic acids, our materials of heredity, DNA and RNA, as well as ATP, the energy carrier of the cell, and phospholipids, an important component of our membranes. The phosphorus is often limiting to plant growth in nature. We'll see the impacts of that when we start talking about the effects. So we start here with phosphorus in the form of rock. It gets weathered through freezing, thawing, raining, heaving up through movement of the earth and so forth, and it is combined with oxygen to form phosphate in either soil or water. That phosphate is once again taken up by plants, which make it into organic compounds and pass it through the food web. Decomposers will break it down and put the phosphate back in the soil or water. Phosphate returns to the form of phosphorus through the process of sedimentation, much like we saw in the carbon cycle, where the carbon dioxide goes into the ocean, can form calcium carbonate, and form sediments from there. Human impact. When we were doing succession, we talked about how the climax forest cycles nutrients quickly. In tropical rainforests, this process is the speediest it is anywhere on Earth. So the tropical forests cycle nutrients quickly. Little is stored in the soil. As soon as a plant drops its leaves on the soil, it decomposes almost immediately and is taken up back into the biomass. When areas of the tropics are deforested for agriculture, that removes all of the nutrients when the biomass is removed. Typically, crop yields are low for a year or two, and then most land gets abandoned after 3 years. Now, indigenous people used this system for thousands and thousands of years. They would clear a little plot of land, they would farm it for a year or two, and then they would abandon it. It wasn't a problem because there weren't a lot of people trying to do that. So as soon as they moved on, there were seeds of the tropical forest all around them that would drop into that cleared plot, and the jungle would restore itself very quickly. The problem now is that so much of the tropical rainforests are being cleared so quickly, and these large areas don't have that kind of seed bank to reestablish the rainforest. Another issue is that those tropical trees evaporated a lot of water, and that was a major contributor in why it would rain every day in the tropical rainforest. So the plants would evaporate the water, that evaporated water would condense, and it would rain just about every day. Once the trees are gone, that process stops, and the area gets drier and drier, so the tropical rainforest can't be restored there. Another issue with the phosphorus cycle is that developed nations have too much phosphorus from industrial and fertilizer runoff. That extra phosphorus in the water can cause algal blooms. This is what's happening in the Gulf of Mexico. When the algae die, the decomposers deplete the oxygen levels, and then the fish die from lack of oxygen.